Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Jonathan Sanders, I'm talking about the debut album from Leftfield, Leftism. Leftfield, boy, now there's a name I haven't thought about in a very long time. The British two-piece outfit of Neil Barnes and Paul Daly is one that did once upon a time pique my interest when I was in high school. I'd so frequently seen them mentioned in the same sentence as some of my all-time favorite bands, like Orbital and The Future Sound of London and The Orb and Underworld and all those other 90s techno legends. And so I gave them a shot back then, and I remember really liking them, but I think I only ever listened to that project, I don't know, twice after finding out they existed. Many years have passed and I completely forgot them, even though they've been lying on my iPod this entire time. Maybe I'd scroll past them and think, oh, I gotta re-listen to that sometime, and then I never actually would. Another thing is that oftentimes when I would look into a band like them, I would like going through their back catalog, and that would usually help establish proper context for said band or artist's legacy and identity and get their standout projects to better stick out in my mind. Leftfield does not have much of a back catalog. They've only released 2 other albums. Rhythm and Stealth in 1999, a pretty solid if kinda forgettable dark breakbeat album, and Alternative Light Source in 2015, which is kinda like a more tedious and dull take on the Glitch Mob's Drink the Sea. You can probably just skip that one. But I only just listened to those 2 projects for the first time this afternoon. Honestly, back when I found out about Leftfield for the first time, I think I mistook Rhythm and Stealth for a live album and assumed this duo to be a one-album wonder, having appeared on the scene briefly for this single, classic project and then promptly disappearing. And for all intents and purposes, they may as well be. As far as I can tell, they're still largely remembered just for this project, and not much else. Regarded by some as one of the greatest dance albums of all time, but the band that created it has kind of been forgotten and lost to history, not retaining much of any of the staying power into the future that a lot of their contemporaries have. When this got requested, I figured this would have to be an interesting video, revisiting this old relic of the past, see whether I've been missing out by not putting this on more often, or find out why it never stuck with me in the long term. So I put on Leftism for the first time in probably a good 8 years or so. How did it hold up? It's pretty good. I don't think I would personally consider it great, though. I wonder if this is going to be like an Oudaker Amber kind of case in which the project helped set into motion a lot of sounds and styles from the time, but other projects came along later that happened to do it better in a more memorable way. But even then, I don't know if this was exactly that massive a game changer even at the time. I mean, not that I was actually there to see it. This project came out the year I was born, 1995. And I'm sure I'll get comments raving about this project, no pun intended, and how it completely blew people's minds then and was completely unlike anything else at the time. But by my perspective, it very much feels like a product of its time, and sounds like several different projects from that era. For instance, I was reminded of Underworld's Dub No Bass with My Headman when it came to the particular style of dance grooves that appear here. There's quite a few dub reggae elements around here that remind me of The Orb, and one voice sample on Inspection Check 1 that The Orb directly used themselves several years prior on their track Outlands. I heard some of those metal hits from The Future Sound of London's Papua New Guinea on the track Open Up. There's even a bit of world beat influence in some parts on tracks like Afro Left, that someone like Banco de Gaia was doing stuff pretty similar to around that time as well. But okay, fine. It may sound like a lot of other bands and artists from that time, but it's not a direct rip-off of any one of them. It would make more sense to me if this was held up less because of any game-changing status and more just because it was a particularly great example of these particular styles and sounds. It certainly does all these sounds well and provides a very effective snapshot of a scene from this different time. This project feels like definitively what the whole 90s UK techno scene sounded like. Like I said, it's a very good album. I think this one just fell through the cracks for me because it was so similar to so many of my favorite artists and didn't do enough to set itself apart as its own thing. I mean, I guess I have similar feelings towards I don't know, B12's Time Tourist. Nothing I can point to that I find objectionable from like a compositional standpoint, but never really stuck with me, as not only is it so centered around styles and sounds that are pretty obviously dated by today's standards, there exists plenty of other projects that did its particular sound in a better and more memorable way. And I definitely prefer this over B12. Much more fun and engaging listen than anything I've heard from them. But okay, may as well get into the individual tracks. The project certainly starts out strong with Release the Pressure, a track that starts out all ambient yet still produced in the most overtly 90s way, but builds up into several different dub reggae grooves a la The Orb's Perpetual Dawn, but with more acid synths. Also featuring a pretty solid vocal performance from Earl 16. I mean, there is nothing about this track that doesn't scream 90s out of every musical element and production choice. But that's the case with every track on here. It'll get tiring if I constantly bring this up. The tune and grooves on Release the Pressure are good, so I like it. A slightly more indicative look of what this album has to offer is its following track, Afro Left. A hard-hitting techno track that tries to incorporate these tribal African rhythms in some parts and has lots of rapping in some other language, care of Djum, or however you say that. I looked it up on Genius, and it's just described as scatting, which, okay. Whether or not the vocals actually mean anything, his appearance does give the track some interesting texture to set itself apart from the crowd, as does that weird Asian, Middle Eastern guitar-like sound. I want to say it's a bansuri, but don't quote me on that. There's also this hooting sample that comes in near the end that I swear I've heard somewhere else before. I feel like it might have been on BT's I'm Up, though I don't know if that's actually right. But I mean, when I said this track was more indicative of the album, I was more referring to the techno groove underneath. Most tracks on here have a similar propulsive, unstoppable groove, and many try to add an extra flavor on top in some different way. Though there are plenty of other slower, more ambient-centric moments here too. Melt, for instance. That's easily one of the best tracks in the bunch. It's certainly one of the most textured, as its various layers of ambient pads, plinky 90s acid stabs, and various flute and trumpet and saxophone licks go up against each other in a particularly evocative and effective way, alongside these crunchy-sounding tribal beats that very much sound sampled from elsewhere, but whatever, it all comes together to make a really cool experience. And then we go back into the techno and house with Songs of Life. Well, this track is like several different sections. It starts with these prototypical 90s synths and wailing vocal, goes into this lengthy breakbeat section that I suppose is a little dub reggae influenced, but not in the most obvious way on this album. Though halfway through switches over into more straightforward progressive house beat a la Union Jack. But if you were worried this section didn't sound 90s enough, there's also gratuitous DJ scratching all over the place too. Because why not? Say what you will about this track's incredible cheesy datedness, it's never boring. And it's still dated in a charming way that reminds you why all these sounds were trendy and became such cliches. And we got another ambient-ish slow burner in Original, also a vocal track with a solid performance from Tony Halliday, singing and talking about finding your own path and that kind of stuff, with a pretty recognizable breakbeat running underneath most of the way through. I know I've heard in at least 2 or 3 other tracks from this era. Also has a nice, long, extended TB303 acid solo. Pretty nice, relatively catchy tune. It'll never be the same again. And there's 2 more techno-centric tracks. There's the thumping and hard-hitting but all too short Black Flute, which in fact does not feature a flute anywhere, but does have plenty of congas. And that track transitions directly into Space Shanty, which is mostly a complete dead ringer for Dubno Bass era Underworld minus Carl Hyde. The techno groove underneath is very similar to something like Cowgirl or Rez. Though I don't think they would be as likely to include those airy vocal snippets in the background, or that little moment, or those little moments of what sounds like, I don't know, pitched up sitars or something. But the groove and the use of those acid synths is totally something they would do. But the track is still great, one of my easy favorites in spite of that. Not only is there a lot of nice progression, the bass line on this track is just too good to write off. It's just undeniably good dance music. Then we get Inspection Check 1, which is one of the lower points for me. It's still good. Has some really solid bass lines and breakbeats, and the whole thing's kind of like a darker companion to the opener on this album. I also kind of like Danny Red's reggae rapping, even if it is kind of on the nose and cliche. Same with all the DJ scratching. But like I mentioned before, it's just that sample that the Orb used on Outlands. It's distracting as hell to hear in this context. Especially since the groove is so similar to that track. You could totally layer the two tracks on top of each other and it would sound totally natural. You can argue which one has the better groove. This one is certainly heavier and bassier, but Outlands easily has the stronger personal connection, so There's also weird fake-out moments where it sounds like the track is about to transition into something completely different for like 2 seconds and then just carries on as if that didn't happen at all. Which I guess is interesting. Not a bad track altogether, just not one of my biggest favorites. But then next you got Storm 3000, which is great. It's more like a drum and bass track. At the very least, it sounds like it's got some pretty present amen breaks running through much of it. Also, the single stabbing chords feel a little early Outtaker-esque. Really fun stuff. And then we hit Open Up, another one of the easiest big highlights from here. Has some of the best grooves on the project, a little early Juno Reactor-esque with the tempo slowed down a bit. Also with a howling performance from John Lydon ranting about how he hates Hollywood and wants it to all burn down, but also kind of wants them to make room for him. Reading the lyrics makes it kind of feel like he was turned down for some kind of job in Hollywood and he's just excessively butthurt about it. But whatever, he does sound cool over the beats and adds texture. One thing I do really like about this track though is that it's kind of like Song of Life in reverse. Another two-parter, but this time the first half is like the more energetic progressive house stuff, and then the second half is the slower breakbeat-y stuff. Nice little connection that makes the album feel more like a complete statement. The album's closer though, 21st Century Poem, is kinda underwhelming and cliche. Like, it's just a straight ambient piece with a deep-voiced spoken word poem, care of Len Sisse, or however you say that, sorry. Kinda just going on about the injustices of the world and fighting the power in a fairly vague, but kinda cleverly rhyming way. How many places will burn before we learn? It's fine, but not exactly the deepest or most evocative stuff you've ever heard. I mean, I think I once saw this guy complain about this album being too political or trying to push an agenda, and this is kind of hilarious to me because the album is, like, barely political at all. It doesn't really make any kind of statement besides really vague fight the power sentiments on maybe 2 tracks. I think the guy was just mad because the album's called Leftism. Whether Leftfield are actually leftist, I could believe it, but it doesn't show in an obvious way on this album. You could tell me the album's only called Leftism because the band's called Leftfield and it goes no deeper than that, and I would believe that just as easily. Yeah, Snivelization this ain't. Not that it's actually trying to be. And at the end, this album has that whole stupid hidden track gimmick that so many albums from this era pull. Like the silence in between is mercifully short, but the actual hidden track is just muddy kick drums that sound like they're playing behind a wall, and there's literally nothing else to it beyond that. Not sure why that needed to be there. But yeah, that's Leftism. I may rag on it, but it's a pretty solid album, I will say. Purely as dance music, it's great. It's the kind of project you can listen to from start to finish and nothing feels out of place despite the wide variety of sounds being explored throughout. Pacing-wise, I have 0 complaints. If you say this is one of the best electronic albums of all time, I feel like I would get it. To me, though, it still doesn't quite hit greatness. The thing about this project, as I've said, it's comprised entirely out of 90s cliches. There is nothing about Leftism, not a singular detail that doesn't just sound like 90s. Now, I'm not typically one to complain about a project's datedness, especially when it comes to this particular scene, which has, like, all my favorite bands in it. But I can compare it to a project that's roughly equally as dated sounding, The Future Sound of London's Accelerator. That's another project that lives and breathes 90s out of every minute detail, but that project holds up so much better to me than this one. It may not have as much stylistic variety as this one, but that one, first of all, it feels like it was helping set off these trends. And I think the songs are better. Not to mention, Papua New Guinea is like the song of this particular era. If someone makes a documentary on this scene, then they are guaranteed to include that track to some extent. Leftism doesn't have a track like Papua New Guinea. By comparison, it feels like it's following these styles because they were currently trendy. They were doing it well enough that it didn't matter, but it doesn't feel nearly as original or forward-thinking as an Accelerator or an Orbital's Green album. Granted, you can also take any of my comments on Leftism's place in history with a grain of salt, because again, I wasn't there to see it. I've just done researching and stuff. I mean, I discovered most of this whole scene through recommendations on iTunes in the late 2000s and early 2010s, and I was definitely late to the punch on Leftfield. By the time I got to checking them out, every sound they'd offered I'd already heard done better by someone else. If Leftfield were your introduction to this scene, I imagine this would stick out so much better in your mind than it does for me. You think this album's incredible, a masterpiece and a 90s classic? Sure, there's nothing weird about that to me. But hearing a comment about this being the first truly complete album experience to come from house musicians and the first quintessentially British one feels like you're pushing it a bit and getting by on like a genre technicality or something. I wouldn't personally call it either the true first of its kind or the best of its kind, but I don't know, at the end of the day, maybe it's best not to think too hard about this one. I mean, I tend to have a knee-jerk reaction to be skeptical when going into a project that I know has an insane amount of hype attached to it, and perhaps as such I hesitate to jump on the bandwagon for this particular one. It is not one of my favorite albums of all time, and I honestly kind of doubt I'm going to be listening to it much after this video goes up. But I get it if that is your perspective and you do consider it one of the all-time greats. Even based on my own experience, there is still a lot to like about Leftism that make it worth giving a shot. It's a very good album that provides an all-around entertaining snapshot of a different time with no truly bad tracks, and I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.